unnerving, and yet you have said in the past, but your most fearful moment was when you played in the percussion section of the New York Philharmonic. Why was that so fearful?
Yes, I played the triangle.
Oh, that explains everything.
With the New York Philharmonic and some other percussion instruments. And the reason it was so terrifying was that in music, you cannot make a mistake. Sports, of course, is predicated on mistakes being made. I mean, in tennis, you put a big slice on the serve and hope the other fellow's not going to hit it. Or in baseball, you throw a sinker or a flutter ball or whatever in the hopes the other guy's not going to hit it. But in music, you cannot make a mistake. If you do, you destroy a piece of art. And I remember when I first joined the orchestra, there was a man there, a violinist, a fellow called Sanford. And he told me that when he first joined the orchestra, he was so frightened of making a mistake. And here's a fellow playing with a lot of other violins, particularly in rehearsal, where the conductor can stop you and say it's a B flat, not a B, that he told me that he put soap on the strings of his violin so that when he played it, no sound came out. And he did that until he got a sense of confidence about where he was and what he was doing. So you can imagine how this affected me. I mean,
You'd be lathering up that triangle, I would imagine.
It's not an instrument you can lather up. When you hit it, it emits a sound. The triangle is an interesting instrument. I once gave a lecture on it. There are 3 terrifying things that can happen if you play the triangle.
Thus the name triangle, I would think.
Yes, a triad of horrors. One of them is if you pick the triangle up and you look around for the stick and you can't find the stick.
That's a problem.
The other is if you pick up the stick and you can't find the triangle. There's a third one, but I've forgotten what it is.
Well, okay, but something happened.
Well, to show you how terrifying it all was, I went on tour with the Philharmonic for a month. I'd gone to Leonard Bernstein, who was the conductor then, and asked him if I could join his orchestra for a month to learn what that was all about. Very much like joining a football team or a baseball team or whatever, what the internal business of the orchestra is like. And he said, "What can you play?" And I told him I could play a sort of a cocktail party piano. I could play Tea for Two and Deep Purple. Those were my
I was just humming those 2 in the shower this morning.
Yeah, my biggies.
Yeah.
And he said, well, we don't really have very much need for that sort of thing around here. And he sent me out to learn percussion. And what was interesting was that when I would hit the triangle properly or these other instruments, musicians have a secret way of applauding each other during the course of a piece of music. And if you watch an orchestra very carefully, sometimes you can see it. It's sort of a shuffle of the foot on the floor of the stage. There was a great oboist with the Philharmonic called Howard Gomberg, a great oboe player, and he would play something in the middle of a concerto or a symphony so brilliantly that all around they would do this little shuffling of the feet. It was their way of acknowledging his brilliance. And when I would hit this triangle properly, all over the orchestra, the feet. But then, I have to be brief about this because it's a long story, I'm afraid, but in a place called London, Ontario, we were playing Mahler's 4th Symphony. And that starts with 18 strokes, as I recall, on an instrument called the sleigh bells, which look like a child's toy. There's a handle and the bells are like this, and you have to tap them 18 times, diminuendo. And they're enormously important notes because they're the very first ones that you hear, and they sort of set the tone and the temper of the symphony. And these things were in my charge, and I did something wrong. I think I got carried away, just didn't stop or something. Or
19, maybe?
Yeah, just banging away, or maybe not enough. I have no idea. I've never really had enough courage to find out what I did wrong, but I knew something had gone wrong because there wasn't any of this. And musicians sort of, and shoulders and all that. And Bernstein, this awful look came over his face, and he kept grim. I remember after the performance, he came back to where I was standing with these, still holding these bells actually. I picked them up and he took them from me really quite violently, and he whacked them down onto a table there on the backstage and shouted at me that I had destroyed Mahler's Fourth, and that he never wanted to hear a sound like that out of his orchestra again. And as far as I knew, I had been fired.
Right, I would think.
And I remember he rushed out into the Canadian night after this distraught man. And the percussionists all came crowding around, and they said, "Don't worry about that, that's a typical conductor's tantrum, you'll be back with us tomorrow," and all of that. And they took me out on the town, and it was very nice of them. They kept telling me stories about percussionists who had gone wrong.
Are there a lot of those?
Well, they said he had enough stories. I remember one of them was of a, what was it, Tchaikovsky's, what is it, the, you know, the one that has fireworks in the middle of it. The what? 1812 Overture, thank you. The, right in the middle of that, there's a great thing that they have. Is outdoors, they have fireworks, and they shoot off cannon or rifles or whatever. Indoors, they have a percussionist backstage who looks through a little hole in the curtain. And when he gets the cue, he fires off this sort of a contraption into a big barrel, and that sort of gives the reverberating sound that's called for in the score. And they told me about, we were in some saloon somewhere, they were telling me all these stories, and they told me that back in the Carnegie Hall days of the Philharmonic, there was this percussionist who had fired off this instrument 60 bars too early. And they said that a lot of them thought a suicide had occurred backstage. There were a lot, they told me about this cymbal player who had brought his cymbals together like this, and one of them had come off and got unscrewed, and it landed right on its edge, like a hubcap, and it sort of went between all the chairs like that.
Kind of an interactive part of the symphony.
Well, the long and short of this is that they decided that they would go and see Bernstein, so one of them remembered that the next night in Winnipeg we were going to be playing Tchaikovsky's Second Symphony, which is called The Little Russian. And at the end of that symphony, there's a great shot on the gong, sort of comes in like an exclamation point. And they felt I had to, you know, climb back on the horse, get my confidence back. And so they went to see with me Bernstein in his penthouse there in the hotel in London, Ontario. It was very late at night. He was striding around with a bathrobe. I remember a terry cloth bathrobe. He's still as angry as a hornet, you know, about what I'd done to him that night. Destroyed the Mahler. And I went in there and I was sort of propped up against a wall. And they pleaded with him, you know, give him another chance. And so finally Bernstein said, looking at me, he said, "All right," he said, "you can play the gong tomorrow night in Winnipeg." It's going to be in Winnipeg. On a number of conditions. He said, "First of all, I want you to watch me throughout the entire symphony. Don't look down at the music. We all know that you can't read music." He said, "You don't fool anybody when you turn the pages back there." He said, "Watch me throughout the entire symphony. And when we get to the fourth movement, about 9 minutes into it, I will give you a cue the likes of which no musician has ever seen before." And he said, upon that, smack it. So there I was, next night, white tie and tails, back of the orchestra. And Bernstein came in, and here's one of the other terrifying things about music, is that once it starts, there's no way that you can stop it. You know, it's not like sports, where, you know, the quarterback goes like that and everything stops, so
right.
Batter steps out of the batter's box and everything stops. So, but in music, once that stick comes down, you are on this treadmill, and it bears you up towards this terrible moment. And we got into the fourth movement, and poor old Bernstein, I really sort of felt sorry for him, because he would look over and he was sort of hoping to see the guy that was always there, you know, the regular percussionist, and instead he would see me sort of, you know, with gong hanging there and this huge mallet, you know, like that. It must have absolutely scared the hell out of him every time he looked over. And he gave this cue, and I read back and whacked this gong, and I don't think a gong has ever been hit that hard. It was hit so hard that the musicians in front all sort of bounced like that.
So you had been given a
great wave went out by their head, went by Bernstein. It was sort of, eyes popped as it went by him, and he had to wait to bring these violins to finish this thing off, and I thought I'd done it again, you know, destroyed another symphony. But then all over the orchestra, the feet began to go like this. And so I'd hit it right on the button. Matter of fact, Bernstein said that he came backstage and he said, wow, you know, no one's ever hit a gong as hard as that. He said, but if Tchaikovsky heard it, which I'm quite sure he did, he would have been delighted.